For months, a large-scale Russian summer offensive was all anyone was talking about. Ever since the reputable US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW for short, warned about the Kremlin's plans, the media has been in a frenzy, labeling the ensuing period as key in the Russo-Ukrainian war and saying that it could even end the war in Ukraine. Western analysts speculated, the Ukrainian government prepared, and the world held its breath. The anticipation was palpable, the tension unbearable, and then nothing. Sure, the much-anticipated summer offensive did come, with a combined force of 40,000 Russian troops launching an assault across Ukraine's northern border on May 9th, Russia's Victory Day, symbolizing the country's triumph over Nazi Germany in World War II. Of course, the date was chosen deliberately to evoke a sense of historical destiny and inevitable success over the neo-Nazi regime, which is what Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed Ukraine has become. Yet despite the dramatic timing and intense build-up, the offensive spluttered and evoked the name of William Shakespeare's famous comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. Even NATO's top officials like Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, weren't sure whether the offensive had actually begun or not, which speaks volumes about its underwhelming execution and lack of impact. Though Russia did make some advances and continues to do so, this summer offensive can, for the most part, be labeled as a colossal failure. Why? And how is it possible for the offensive previously hailed as the war-ending blow to come to a halt after barely a few miles in? That's precisely what you'll find out in this video. You'll also learn how and why the offensive started in the first place, what it aimed to achieve, and what's in store for the future of this conflict. Let's begin. The number one question that probably comes to mind when hearing about a Russian summer offensive is, how was Russia even able to launch it? After all, the Russian armed forces had faced significant setbacks in the preceding months and, let's face it, the entire invasion of Ukraine. According to a May 8th report by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, by the invasion date, Russia had lost as many as 477,430 troops in Ukraine. Similar losses in equipment were reported as well, with Russia bidding farewell to 7,418 tanks, 14,246 armored fighting vehicles, 16,549 vehicles and fuel tanks, 12,317 artillery systems, 1,057 multiple launch rocket systems, 792 air defense systems, 349 aircraft, 325 helicopters, 9,728 drones, 26 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. So how was Russia able to pull off an offensive in the summer of 2024? The answer is simple. Russia did what Russia does best: exploit vulnerabilities. You see, Russia has suffered immense losses since February 24, 2022, when the invasion first started. But so did Ukraine. The defending force was grappling with a shortage of men and ammunition, allowing Russia to capitalize on these weaknesses. However, there was one thing that primarily gave Russia the initiative to launch its summer offensive: the delay in Western aid. The US, Ukraine's largest donor, with over $43 billion in military aid provided in just 2 years, faced a challenging period starting in the fall of 2023 when new aid packages were held up. This delay was primarily due to the intense debates in Congress, where some members questioned the continuation of military support in the face of competing domestic priorities. During these discussions, concerns over immigration and border security took center stage, leading to a temporary pause in aid decisions. Unfortunately, while these debates were ongoing, the Ukrainian battlefield faced significant challenges. The delay in military supplies allowed Russia to capitalize on its temporary advantage in firepower, escalating attacks along the 600-mile front. These operations started in October 2023 and had a single goal: to demoralize Ukraine in the West. As months passed and no aid arrived, the Russian armed forces became wrongly convinced that their plan was working. That's where the idea for the summer offensive was likely conceived. Thanks to making some tactical gains in midwinter, the Kremlin seemingly became convinced that it could eventually collapse the Ukrainian defense line, as an ISW report puts it, and so the preparations began. Obviously, the ultimate goal was to cause a general collapse of the Ukrainian front line and achieve a grand Russian breakthrough after months of suffering humiliating losses. But what were the specific military objectives of the summer offensive? The truth is, no one outside the Kremlin knows. The summer offensive has been executed so poorly that all we're left with is guesswork and speculation about its true military objectives. According to Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Russia's goal was only to stretch out Ukraine's forces and deal a decisive blow to its combat strength. Others saw the summer offensive as a blitzkrieg attempt whose ultimate goal was Kyiv, the city that Putin has long coveted as the ultimate prize. He holds an almost mystical reverence for Kyiv, considering it the very heart of Russian civilization. However, the prevailing view is that the Russian summer offensive is nothing but a ruse. You see, the offensive was launched in the Kharkiv Oblast, opening a new northern front in Ukraine. However, many analysts believe that seizing Kharkiv isn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is for the Ukrainian troops to believe Russia is after Kharkiv, compelling them to redeploy their eastern forces to the north. With Ukraine's position in the east weakened, Russia would be able to achieve its true goal, capturing, or as the Kremlin puts it, liberating the entire Donetsk Oblast. Seizing Donetsk has long been one of Putin's main goals, as it would solidify Russia's control over a crucial part of eastern Ukraine and bolster the Kremlin's strategic position in the region. After Donetsk, there's Luhansk, and before you know it, the Kremlin could potentially establish a contiguous corridor of control through the Donbas region. Of course, there are also those who believe that the Russian commanders purposefully made the goals of the summer offensive unclear, allowing them to change them depending on the Ukrainian response. While this approach can be viewed as flexible, it likely reflects a lack of clear strategy and tendency toward opportunistic, reactive planning rather than decisive, well-thought-out objectives, aka the Russian special. But to be honest, by now it doesn't even matter what the initial goals were or whether they even existed. All that matters is that Russia failed to achieve them. Before discussing why, let's do a brief overview of the course of the summer offensive and the tactics used to understand how the situation unfolded and went wrong. As mentioned, the offensive officially started on May 9th. However, May 10th was when the Russian forces started shelling positions in the direction of the city of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv Oblast using guided bombs. The very same day, the Russian troops attempted to break through the front line, with about 5 Russian infantry battalions crossing the state border and capturing the villages of Borisivka, Krasna, Pilna, and Strilecha. From there, Russia made some of its biggest territorial gains in 18 months. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian forces seized control of roughly 10 villages by May 17th, advancing some 6 miles into the Kharkiv Oblast. However, it's important to note that these villages were mostly lightly defended small settlements. The offensive operations continued every day throughout May, but no changes to the front lines were recorded. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia's much-anticipated summer offensive stalled by early June, before the summer even officially began. By June 6th, the Russian forces ceased their offensive towards Lipsy, a village in Kharkiv Oblast the Russians were previously heavily pursuing. This probably had to do with the stiff Ukrainian defenses waiting for them in the area, reinforced by a few mechanized brigades, each about 2,000 strong, that arrived from the south. The Ukrainian forces also intensified counterattacks, managing to push their Russian counterparts back from several areas. By the end of June, there were no changes to the front line, and Ukraine managed to recapture many of the positions the Russian troops claimed in the initial push. July started just as forcefully, with the 3rd Assault Brigade claiming that it eliminated an entire battalion of Russian soldiers, killing 154 and wounding 301. The brigade also took credit for the destruction of a D-20 howitzer, 3 Russian-made Zala drones, and a tank. The fighting continued throughout July, and yet there were no recorded changes to the front line. On July 14th, the ISW reported a claim that the Russian Northern Grouping of Forces, the unit responsible for the summer offensive, didn't have enough troops for a fully fledged penetration of Ukrainian defenses to a depth of 25 miles. As you can see, the Russian tactic of pursuing multiple efforts simultaneously up and down the front didn't exactly pan out. Of course, Putin framed the embarrassing performance of his troops in Kharkiv Oblast as intentional, saying that Moscow isn't seeking any quick gains and that slow advances are all part of their strategy. As for the specific tactics used on the battlefield, they can best be described in one word: bizarre. Based on the accounts of the Ukrainian soldiers, the Russian troops would put soldiers on motorcycles and send them off toward the front line. The goal was to ride as fast as possible and avoid being hit. The ones who survived this suicide mission would ditch the bikes and move into trenches, fighting as infantry. This insane tactic had to be deployed for one reason: Russia has had issues with the lack of armor for its ground forces. Another solution for this issue came in the form of the so-called turtle tanks. Turtle tanks are makeshift armored vehicles, often cobbled together from available resources to compensate for the shortage of the more advanced and heavily protected tanks. These vehicles resemble a moving barn, and their goal is to absorb fire in an effort to clear a path for other units. With these risky tactics in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia lost quite a few military personnel and much equipment in this summer offensive. But before discussing the reasons why this offensive failed so spectacularly and resulted in excessive loss of people and weapons, let's focus on the one that set the stage for the failure in Kharkiv Oblast: poor preparation. As mentioned, the idea for the Russian summer offensive was born out of the opportunity to exploit the destabilization of the Ukrainian forces due to a lack of military aid. As months dragged on, only 2 scenarios emerged for Ukraine. One, it would not be receiving US military aid again, as the political climate shifted and the support for Ukraine within the country waned. or 2, the delivery of aid would eventually resume, but it would take some time before the first weapons arrived in Ukraine. Although the Kremlin was convinced that scenario number 1 was far more likely, the Russians still didn't want to take any chances. This meant that they only had a limited window of opportunity to strike before the arrival of resumed US security assistance. So the Russian armed forces rushed to carry out their theater-wide offensive. However, in doing so, they seemingly forgot a crucial aspect of military strategy: thorough preparation. Benjamin Franklin once said, "If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail." And that's precisely what Russia did. The hasty approach led to poorly coordinated efforts, a lack of clear objectives, and a failure to truly capitalize on the initial advantage they sought to exploit. According to Kaufman, the offensive was launched way too early. His exact words were, "It's now clear that the Russians launched the Kharkiv offensive about a month before it was planned. The idea was to take the Ukrainian forces by surprise, which was somewhat accomplished based on the initial Russian success. However, the offensive seemingly took the Russians by surprise too, as some of the units assigned to the operation, such as the 4th Army Corps, hadn't even finished training. So instead of Ukrainians peeling troops out of the Donbass to send them up north, which was one of the goals of the offensive, the Russians ended up reassigning troops from the east. The lack of proper preparation can also be seen in the fact that the summer offensive was supposed to be carried out with 100,000 soldiers. However, even well past the start of the offensive, the ISW estimated there were 70,000 soldiers at most, even placing the lower end of the estimate at 30,000. It's clear that the Kremlin didn't allow sufficient time to mobilize, train, and deploy the necessary forces, further exacerbating the Russian operational deficiencies. So instead of taking Kharkiv Oblast by storm, all that Putin's poorly prepared offensive managed to achieve was to produce catastrophically high casualty rates. How high are we talking? The highest in the entire conflict. According to the British Ministry of Defense, Russia was losing as many as 1,262 soldiers per day in May and 1,162 in June. Similar figures were seen in July and August, with Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi explaining that the Russians were willing to suffer heavy losses for minor gains. But if we're being honest, this is nothing new in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Even if the summer offensive was carefully planned and executed, chances are there would still be high casualty rates due to Putin's fondness for the so-called meat grinder military tactic. This tactic essentially involves overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers, sending wave after wave of troops into battle regardless of the heavy losses. In Kharkiv, Putin showed that even a lack of substantial troop numbers didn't prevent him from sacrificing Russian lives with similar tactics. The motorcycle riders we discussed earlier are a prime example of this brutal strategy, which highlights the costly nature of Russia's approach to warfare. As operator Starsky, a Ukrainian veteran and blogger, puts it, Russians use their soldiers as cannon fodder. This is further proven by sending soldiers to battle in embarrassingly small units once the meat grinder runs out of large quantities of meat. According to numerous Western analysts, that's precisely what prevented Russia from making any substantial gains, let alone a breakthrough in Ukraine's defensive lines in Kharkiv. Approximately 10 to 15 unmounted infantry troops would make probing attacks to test defenses. In worst-case scenarios, as few as 6 men would try to sneak across no man's land to gain a trench foothold. But regardless of the exact approach the Russian forces take, the result remains the same: a substantial loss of life. From there, their general approach is just to mobilize more troops once the initial waves have been depleted. That's why Russia has been mobilizing about 30,000 people per month since 2024 began. As a result of this horrifying approach, Russia lost over 70,000 troops in only 2 months, with the Kharkiv offensive significantly contributing to these figures. This astronomical figure, provided by British intelligence, includes both wounded and killed soldiers. With it, the total number of Russian troop losses in Ukraine from February 24, 2022 to July 31, 2024 amounts to an astronomical 578,120. Worst of all, as long as the summer offensive continues, Russia's casualty rates are likely to average above 1,000 per day. Now, there's a reason why the numbers of killed and injured soldiers are reported together. In general, the soldiers who have been gravely injured on the battlefield don't return to the fight, meaning they contribute to the general loss of combat effectiveness. However, when it comes to Russia, any rules of military engagement fly straight out of the window, not unlike many of Putin's adversaries. You see, the members of the Ukrainian army have reported numerous cases of injured Russian soldiers being sent back to the front lines despite suffering debilitating injuries. Of course, by going back, they've all but signed their death warrant, raising the number of Russian fatalities and further weakening their offensive. Unfortunately, these cases aren't even the most horrific stories coming from the Russian ranks. According to operator Starsky, there are many reported cases, and even more disturbingly, videos, of Russian forces committing suicide because they're left stranded by their own, abandoned in dire conditions with no medical support or hope of rescue. With how little the Kremlin cares about its soldiers, can anyone truly blame them for the lack of morale and dedication needed to pull off something as ambitious as the summer offensive? What further complicates their situation is the heavy equipment losses in Kharkiv. After all, a soldier without proper gear is a sitting duck doomed to face slaughter. For Russia, the trouble lies in the fact that it can't replace the destroyed equipment. Even though Putin has ramped up military production to unprecedented levels, the constraints on the Russian defense industrial base are more than evident. For now, Ukrainian forces seem to be most proud of destroying Russian tanks, which forces the country's troops to resort to their ridiculous turtle tanks and fighter jets like the Sukhoi Su-25, which have been launching the devastating guided aerial bombs used in the region. When it comes to destroying Russian equipment in the border areas, the Ukrainian forces have seemed to heavily focus on the country's air defense systems. While these actions have contributed to significant Russian losses during the offensive, they primarily reflect a strategic focus on crippling key components of Russia's military capability before a crucial event: the arrival of the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jets. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading for these jets practically since the invasion started. Even after Western allies finally pledged a number of the F-16s to Ukraine, the delivery has been plagued by numerous delays, leaving the Ukrainian forces waiting and hoping for a decisive boost to their air capabilities. Even so, they work on creating the right conditions for when these aircraft finally came. And good news for Ukraine, on July 31st, the first batch officially arrived. For now, we don't know how many jets Ukraine received and where they all came from. All we know is that they are part of at least 79 units pledged by the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium and Norway, and that they have the potential to completely crush the Russian offensive. The same goes for the rest of the Western-supplied military aid. Following the 6-month-long legislative blockade of the $61 billion military aid package for Ukraine, the US rushed to deliver help to the country as soon as the package was approved in late April. Of course, such a huge amount of aid has to be transferred in stages, but the first installment already made all the difference in the Kharkiv Oblast. Thanks to the ammunition and armored vehicles received from the US, the Ukrainian forces were able to fight back more and more as the offensive progressed. So while aiming to take advantage of the lack of aid, the Kremlin only managed to get the military aid package passed and delivered sooner. However, this isn't even the most consequential outcome of Russia's summer offensive. Thanks to this offensive, Ukraine's Western allies finally allowed the country to do something it had pleaded for since the invasion started: strike targets on Russian soil. You see, prior to June 2024, the Ukrainian forces were only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to defend their territories, including the occupied areas. This significantly limited their operational scope and the potential to disrupt the Russian war machine. Seeing all the initial chaos caused by the summer offensive, the US finally lifted the ban, with other major European allies like the UK and Germany following suit. However, it's important to note that the ban was only lifted partially. What does this mean? It means that Ukraine still can't use Western-supplied weapons to indiscriminately target Russia. It can only use these weapons to target border areas used to launch attacks on Ukraine during the Kharkiv offensive. Though not an ideal scenario, this permission has been sufficient to apply pressure to Russian supply lines and command posts, halting the summer offensive. Generally speaking, Ukraine starting to fight back has been one of the major reasons Russia's summer offensive failed. When the offensive was first announced, most military experts were rather pessimistic about Ukraine's fate due to the country's severe shortage of troops, shells, and pre-established defensive positions. But then Ukraine managed to adapt and overcome, as it always does. Each of these problems was gradually being addressed. The lack of shells was covered by the incoming Western aid. To address the lack of soldiers, Zelensky signed a bill lowering the mobilization age for combat duty from 27 to 25. Though the numbers of subsequently drafted soldiers are kept a secret, it's clear that the bill helped Ukraine generate more fighting power in Kharkiv and beyond almost instantly. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin didn't account for this when preparing the summer offensive, just as it didn't account for the arrival of the aid or stiff Ukrainian resistance. Echoing the sentiment of the entire invasion, Russia's miscalculations cost the country any potential victory in Kharkiv and beyond. All things considered, it becomes obvious why the Kharkiv offensive has been a huge failure. Not only did the offensive fail to accomplish any of the supposed goals, but it also actually weakened Russia's position in Ukraine. The Russian forces practically squandered firepower, which might have made a difference in another portion of the 600-mile front line. That's not to mention that the offensive cost thousands of soldiers' lives after being forced to attack on foot while unprotected. But take heart. Despite the challenges, Ukraine has shown remarkable strength and determination in the face of Russia's aggression. While there have been signs of continued Russian activity in Kharkiv as of August 1st, these are more of a reflection of Russia's desperation than its strength. Ukraine has successfully averted the worst-case scenario, and this is no small feat. With each passing day, Ukraine's forces grow stronger and more unified, ready to face whatever comes next. The journey is far from over, but Ukraine is more than capable of turning these ongoing challenges into future victories. So what do you think? Which will be next? Will it happen in Kharkiv or another part of the front line? If you're going with Kharkiv, do you think Russia has any chance to recover in this region, or is the summer offensive officially a lost cause? Share your opinions in the comments section below. Now go and check out why the Russian military is completely failing on all fronts, or click this other video instead.